And hi to everybody out there in the ether. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So yeah, as John said, I lead our climate risk management work for WWF in the US and our headquarters here. That largely consists of this partnership with Colombia, which has really expanded to a lot of different projects around the world. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to largely avoid a lot of the really super technical issues and try to focus mostly on lessons learned. So it's called the ADVANCE Partnership. It's not a true acronym. Adaptation for Development and Conservation. Don't try and fit that in. Between WWF US and, as John said, the Center for Climate Systems Research, which is part of the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York. It started in 2015, so in a quick couple of years, we rapidly expanded to doing work in 11 countries with project proposals for even more than that, including a few for that have USAID funding as well. All over the world, from Central and South America to Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia. There's varying degrees of engagement in all of those places. So why advance? When most of us think about climate science, we typically think of images like this, extremely complicated graphs and figures and those types of maps that have all different colors that seem kind of indecipherable or at least at the very least overwhelming. And so we really wanted to tackle this problem of the kind of glut of really complicated information and how to translate that and tailor that into a much more usable form for our own projects and engagements around the world. So this article kind of puts it perfectly. I find myself using this phrase all the time about turning the flood of climate information into a usable stream. So that's really what we're trying to do in a lot of these places that we work in around the world through various different projects. And then more recently, so that article's from 2015. Just from the end of last year, there was a study that came out in PLOS One talking about how narrative style influences citation frequency. So in other words, the more narrative the climate science, the easier it is to interpret and understand, the more frequent it gets cited. So to me, that lends a lot of credence to our approach and really the need to get away from this super quantitative, heavy, overly complex climate science-y, atmospheric dynamics type of climate science to get it into a format that's a lot more easy to use and absorb and inform decision making. So let's unpack that a little bit more. These were the sort of perceived limitations or problems with climate science that we started with excuse me, when ADVANCE started. One of the problems is a lack of historical data. That's especially the case in a lot of the developing countries that we work in. We just don't have these long 30-year time horizons or observed data sets that can tell us what's been happening in the climate. It's not really downscaled to the proper landscape. We find ourselves having to go into national level communication documents for the UNFCCC, National Adaptation Programs of Action, try to interpret from that into our conservation landscapes. And so, we really lack that information specific to the project geographies that we're working in. And then, of course, the 2100 problem. Maybe this isn't so much of a problem these days, but a lot of the climate science that when I started in my career working on climate change, everything seemed to be in the terms of the year 2100. This is what's going to happen by 2100. I still think that is the case. We still see a lot of climate information presented in this way. Minus some minor miracles of medicine, nobody in this room is going to be around until 2100. So, when you see numbers like that, you just kind of glaze over and it doesn't seem relevant. So we really wanted to change that. And then lastly, that really there's too much uncertainty for this information to be useful. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. So we're kind of paralyzed by that information. It's hard to act when there's just wildly different estimates of what could happen. This is a lot to chew on, for sure. And I will not say that ADVANCE even remotely tried to tackle all of these, and we've solved all of these problems. Definitely not. We bit off a little bit of this, and to the extent that we could improve in any way on any of this is an accomplishment for us. So with all of that in mind, our approach is to build climate resilience through what we call co-generation of tailored climate risk information, and then working with stakeholders to incorporate that into conservation and development planning, policies, and practice. So it's really much more of a kind of a climate smarting approach rather than finding discrete adaptation projects from the very beginning. So what does that mean? We're just bringing stakeholders into the process, into the actual generation of the climate science. So we're getting a sense of what their decision and planning needs are at the very beginning to then work with them to figure out what the most useful format is for that information. So that involves in-country workshops, interviews, meetings with a variety of different stakeholders from our own WWF local staff. So we have field staff in more than 100 countries. They are very much a stakeholder here too. Because in a lot of ways, they're the most capacitated to actually take this information and run with it and incorporate it into their conservation work. But also working with communities and then, and of course, government departments. So based on those early, or based on the problems that we identified from the very beginning, we made some quick kind of early improvements. Downscaling the projections, the climate risk analysis to the specific geographies that we're working in. We're focusing on nearer term timeframes, so out the next 30 years, let's say. Doesn't mean that we're also not looking at farther than that. It just means that we emphasize more this immediate term, so that right there you have much more of a hook for somebody who's trying to look at climate risk from a planning perspective. It's much more real to talk about the next 20 or 30 years than it is the next 60 or 70. Locally appropriate seasons determined by stakeholders. This is an interesting one that probably seems obvious to a lot of us now, but a lot of climate projections were generated in the 4 seasons of the Northern Hemisphere and Western countries. That is not how most people think in the tropics. It tends to be a wet season and a dry season, right? It's much more bimodal. Or different than that. It just really depends on the context. And then lastly, we're making the uncertainty explicit from the very beginning. And I'll explain more what that means. So really we're focusing on a range, always presenting a range of data instead of a multimodal average. Bear with me, this is the most complex I'll probably get in this presentation. But if you look at this figure, and you look at each of those different colored lines looking out into the 2040s, each one of those would be a model estimate of, say, what will happen with precipitation in the future. If you took the average of all of those, what would it tell you? 0% change or no change at all. If you present that to a decision maker or planner, they're going to get a false sense of certainty about what's going to happen. They're going to say, no change. We don't need to worry about climate change. The reality is, though, that that's a range from as much of a 30% decrease to a 30% increase. So we're always emphasizing that range. It presents new problems to do that, but at the very least, we're being explicit about the uncertainty inherent in models. So what does that actually look like? This is hot off the presses, brand new, from our climate risk report for Myanmar. One of the things that we're trying to do with Advance is present information in better ways too. So a lot of our work is about communications and data visualization. I'm not saying that this is the best graph I've ever seen, but it's at least an attempt to depict that a little bit differently. So this is what it looks like when we always talk about the ranges. So this shows you that, you know, it's pretty obvious for temperature, but again, looking at that range is very different than looking at the average. It shows you the potential huge increase that could happen. And always divided by season. The number of times in the past I've seen annual change information that's just, to me, is almost useless. The seasons are what you plan around. That's the most important to depict, really. And that's especially the case when you talk about precipitation or changes in rainfall. So this is where it gets interesting and more complicated when you're showing the ranges. So annually, we can see that it's increasing. But that's largely driven by a definite increase in the wet season. In the hot season and the cool season, it's much more complicated. You see a much larger range of a decrease to an increase. And that's where we would want to get into a scenario planning process. If you don't know what's going to happen, it could be a decrease or an increase, and you have to really try and plan for both. But what I think this does do for us is at the very least highlight general trends. So we can definitely plan on an increase in the wet season at the very least. So that's just to give you a sense of some early changes that we've been making. And so now I'm going to go through a couple of cases of where we've tried to apply that advanced approach. There's a few copies here if you want to use this or take it home with you. It's a little bit out of date at this point, even just based on the learning that we've already absorbed. So, mangrove conservation in Colombia. I obviously got the message about safety. Clearly everybody else didn't. So we have WWF does a lot of work in the Pacific coast with these extremely vulnerable communities that literally live right on the water in these homes on stilts. It's typically a marginalized community that has been living like this for a long time. And so what we're doing there is working on mangrove conservation. And one of the key ecosystem services that the people in this community or in this area rely on is this little mussel here. It's called a piangua. Very important for their food source and also as a livelihood. They can sell it. So from a climate risk perspective, this is a particularly important thing that we would want to know what's going to happen to this in the future. We're also doing a lot of mangrove restoration. This shows you an example of a tree farm, a mangrove farm. So same questions arise there. How should we be doing this in a climate smart way? What does our information about the climate, predicted climate in the future, tell us about how we should be changing our restoration now? One of the problems that they're battling is a blight, for example. We know that generally deforestation is a huge issue. People are just cutting for building materials and so on. So this is the information that we have to deal with. This is the projection information for rainfall for that particular part of the coast. So as you can see, it presents some challenges, right? No obvious trends really emerge from this data. So that really immediately right there brought into some sort of stark contrast one of the big lessons in doing this work. So we have no idea, for example, or what we realized was that we don't know enough about the species that we're planting in these mangrove systems to be able to say how they're going to be affected by these types of changes in the future. Or for the piangua. Sea level rise, it gets a little bit more obvious. And this is a part of the world that's going to see a lot of sea level rise. And again, I just want to highlight how much of a difference there is here in focusing on the averages versus the ranges. There's a huge amount of variability in this range. I mean, you could see very extreme levels of sea level rise, which are actually probably more accurate based on how conservative we've been in sea level rise estimates so far. So this is a lot of change that, you know, based on this, we should probably be planning for, you know, somewhat of a retreat, figuring out a way for these communities to survive in this area in the future. What that means for our mangrove restoration program, you know, who knows? Lots of uncertainty and lots of big questions. So the most obvious lesson that we learned there, we got the region's best academics on mangroves and coastal ecosystems together in a workshop to talk about climate risk to these systems, and they really had no idea how they were going to change based on the information that we provided on temperature increases and sea level rise and freshwater changes. You could start to imagine how, for example, a mangrove might be vulnerable to a salinity change or a change in freshwater upstream. But they didn't have a sense of exactly what those really important thresholds were to plan. So we really just don't have not nearly enough of an understanding of how specific species and ecosystems are going to respond to climate change to really make use of even better climate risk information. So there's this tension where we're trying to bring the climate science down into a much more easily adopted format, but on the other side, that we also still don't have enough information on the system dynamics. So trying to bring those worlds together to really plan for important thresholds is the ultimate goal, but we're still not there yet. And that's a lot of our learning so far. So one of the to counter that, the action there is to really, to identify these known unknowns, and we can thank Donald Rumsfeld for this. All of us in the climate community keep coming back to these phrases. Known unknowns meaning at least we know the research question. We know what we don't know about the system, as opposed to unknown unknowns where we really have no idea what the interactions could be. So we really need to do a lot more monitoring for ecological change connected to weather, and that should really be built into every single conservation program that we're funding. So Myanmar. Lots of, a few different types of engagement here, so I'm going to go through a few different examples. The first, the hook here for us was a natural capital assessment. Hang on, I need have my Marco Rubio moment here. It's a tiny water bottle. That's true. So the previous president of Myanmar asked WWF, because he's a geographer and I guess he loved maps, to create an assessment in our brand new, at that point, very brand new program. The office has only been open for a few years after the democratic reforms, to create a map nationwide of the natural capital base. In other words, what are the ecosystems that are currently intact in Myanmar? And also, what are the ecosystem services produced by those areas? So things like carbon storage and sequestration, water yield, and so on. And so this is one of the first opportunities that we could really engage with advance in WWF work. And so we wanted to make sure that this mapping was done in a climate smart way. In other words, we don't want just a snapshot, a static snapshot in time of the ecosystem service and natural capital base, but also what's going to happen in the future under climate change, so we can plan for changes in those ecosystem services. In an ideal world, well, so we combine the climate risk information that we produce. So for example, a low and a high estimate, again, we're always talking about ranges here of temperature and then precipitation on the right. It's not really important to stare at this for a long time. But this information then goes into a couple of different ecosystem service models. So for example, looking at the effects of climate change on sediment retention. So for the low estimate of precipitation change in Myanmar, which basically shows either almost a decrease or a very minimal increase in rainfall, you see almost a decrease in the change in the sediment retention that's created by intact forests. So how much sediment is retained by the landscape and by the ecosystems that are currently intact. Under a high estimate, where we see a big increase in rainfall for Myanmar nationwide, you see actually a pretty big change in sediment retention. In other words, that service becomes much more important under RCP 8.5 high climate change estimate in the future. There's a ton of uncertainty in these models, admittedly. They're models, right? But at the very least, this shows us how this ecosystem service becomes even more important under climate change in the future in Myanmar. Same goes for flood risk reduction. Again, low estimate for change on the left, high estimate for change on the right. And this just shows you how much more important the flow retention, in other words, how much the forest is retaining water, how important that is in the future under, again, a high estimate of change. So this is when this is sort of working pretty well. We've integrated the climate risk, the projections into these ecosystem service models. But as we look at different models, they're not so dynamic. They're not really built to handle a lot of the complexity that we know is inherent with climate change and climate risk. So if we look at the map on the left, sea level rise, there really shouldn't be a legend there. It's the same number basically along the whole coast. You know those GIS people, they always want a legend regardless of whether it needs one. But our coastal vulnerability model for Myanmar doesn't actually, so coastal vulnerability is basically just a function of intact forests, coral reefs, seagrasses, how much they are providing a coastal defense for the number of people that live in those areas. So the darker red means that there's a lot of defenses provided for those people based on the ecosystems that are there. But we can't integrate sea level rise into the coastal vulnerability model. So there's no way to really depict. So to me, this is like a now coastal vulnerability model. It's not showing you what could happen realistically with the amount of sea level rise that's projected for Myanmar. So there are a lot of different pretty technical lessons that we've learned. You know, this is very different than working to simplify information for coastal community planning in Colombia. It's working with a very highly technical, high capacity group to try and integrate these two types of models. But we realized that the ecosystem service models that are a part of INVEST and that we've been working with in the Natural Capital Project are just not built to handle climate complexity in a real way. There's a lot of work that needs to be done moving forward to really better integrate those things. So what we're doing up until now is creating ecosystem service models and maps that are going to be quickly useless because they don't account for climate risk. Second point, we came in midstream as bringing in the climate expertise after the project had already been running for a while. And that presented a lot of challenges because the questions that we would have asked, the services we would have focused on, the models we would have used would have been very different if they were part of that team from the very beginning. And then the third point, which was maybe somewhat of a surprise, but even the best ecosystem service mappers, modelers in the world still needed a lot of help in understanding uncertainty and climate risk and climate modeling. So we always need to do more training, even at the highest levels. People still don't totally grasp a lot of these core concepts. I hope that wasn't too honest for my ecosystem service modeling friends. So the second part of this engagement, born out of this natural capital mapping process, we worked with the Department of Meteorology and Hydrology in Myanmar. This is the building right there. And then Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation. We had a meeting with DMH. We told them what we were doing, and they said, we'll give you some data, a nationwide climate projections and analysis of historical risk. That's what we did. This is literally where they do their presenting. Pretty interesting. And it was interesting. So what we did, we had a training where it was a multi-sectoral training. We were getting people from various different departments, agriculture, forestry, as well as DMH, to try and get DMH into a capacity to be the kind of climate change expertise in the room. And what we did was go through this kind of system. I keep using the clicker, it doesn't work on the TV. The system drawing, where you get a sense of what like an example farming ecosystem simplified drawing, and then placing the climate change information on that map to make those connections. And so we did this in different groups and had DMH staff. So this woman there over the table works at DMH as the kind of the climate expertise. This was a really interesting exercise because it was obvious that it doesn't ever happen. This is a very kind of rigid government silos. These are, DMH largely sees itself as the weather people. Weather forecasting, they are not the climate change people or the climate risk people. But that's starting to change, and they've recognized that they need to take a bigger role in that. But the idea of helping their colleagues understand climate risks was even more foreign in that context. So this is just a better, sort of gives you a sense of what those maps look like. This is a great exercise in the little bit that we've done with this in advance over the last couple of years. It really does help people connect in a very real way. So lessons learned here, the most useful information is in the extremes. So what do I mean by that? We can only get a sense of future extremes if we actually have observed weather data in the past. So we're stuck in a bit of a catch-22 there. But what we found was, this figure, I'll explain this figure because this shows you the extremes that I'm talking about, was that this was one of the best ways to communicate climate risk to people in Myanmar. it shows you low and high estimates depending on how far in the future of the increase in the number of very hot days, like an extreme heat day. So if you're looking at the next 30 years, the high estimate is 6 more of those days in the hottest month of the year. Out into the future, you're talking about 15 more of those very hot days. So all of a sudden, half the month becomes the single hottest day that you're experiencing right now. That was something that people really could easily grasp onto. And that's the type of really like concrete morsel of information that's especially useful. And as I was already mentioning this, there's a limited capacity for climate risk assessment. You know, there was DMH had recently gotten some training on creating climate projections, but the training that they received, there was no communication about why to create the projections in the first place, or what the purpose was, what the ultimate use of those projections was. It was all about the methodology and the approach. And so we saw presentations that was just, you know, here's 18 different models, 25 different runs, just slamming up graphs one after another. And not, you know, understanding that the ramifications of that information for planning for Myanmar. I already mentioned the silos. And then this last point about seasons being a slippery concept. We based our seasons in Myanmar on the National Adaptation Program of Action document, which was created by the Ministry of the Environment and the Department of Meteorology and Hydrology. And then 6 months after we'd already developed the projections and run all the models, they came back to us and said that our seasons were wrong. Their understanding of a hot season was different than what the previous NAPA document said it was. So it really does matter, and they were very, very vehement about this. You need to move this month into this season. And so we ended up having to do that, you know, at the last minute. And I've found that in other places this has also been the case. Like it's hard to pin down exactly when is the wet or the dry season. We also further took this information the next step through some work with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation and the UN Habitat, which was doing some vulnerability assessment planning in 2 places, in the dry zone and in the Irrawaddy Delta. And so we took that information out into local communities and explained to them the climate risks, walked through some exercises that kind of look like this, where you present the projection or the change, and then you basically draw arrows to the hazards and then list out the impacts. But because we don't have a lot of data, the other point that I forgot to mention was that this was an ecosystem-based adaptation project. In other words, it was using ecosystems to help people respond to climate change impacts. But we realized that there was so little data on the ecosystems and the ecosystem services that even with that climate risk information, we didn't have enough to really plan in a very concrete way to really build up those ecosystem services. So the best that we can do is plan for these very general trends, increasing temperatures, increasing variability and extremes in precipitation. But it's not like when you're building a dike and you need to know exactly the level of flood rise in a floodplain. Ecosystems are a lot more messy when it comes to planning for this stuff. And then, so ultimately the place that we get to is that the best options from an ecosystem perspective is just to reverse the massive degradation trends that are underway. Deforestation is Myanmar is the 2nd fastest deforesting country in the world right now. Crazy trends. They're basically going to be gone of primary forests, primary mangrove forests in the Irrawaddy Delta by 2025 if the trends continue. So in those cases, we get reduced to the best possible option being to just reverse that trend if you're trying to keep ecosystem services intact. But there are still obviously huge uncertainties about that. How does that survive in the face of sea level rise in the future, for example? So far, I've basically highlighted more questions than answers. I don't know. So I'll just quickly run through some general lessons to review. there's a huge need for capacity development, especially in the developing world, but also obviously even amongst ourselves for understanding climate risks. I think we're getting better and better on the climate risk side, but we still need a lot more effort on the system dynamics, really understanding the most important variables in those local ecosystems. Projections are helpful for those general trends, but we really should try and use that observed weather station data where we can, because that's how we can get those much more useful morsels of data about what could happen in the future. Communicating uncertainty explicitly, always talking about the ranges, is a more honest approach. It doesn't create false certainty, but it also creates a lot more work and kind of leads to some ambiguous outcomes. By a lot more work, I mean we have to do scenario planning. Scenario planning is hard with 25 of the best scientists in the world. You know, it's not an easy process. So doing that in a local context in the developing world is even more difficult. And you know, this is obvious for so many different types of conservation and development work, but it's really clear that we can't just provide better climate risk information and hope that our field staff and teams and their partners run with it. There's a lot more hand-holding that needs to go on for a much longer period of time. And the other point here is that taking a climate smarting lens to an existing project that's been running for a long time is often too late. We really need to, at least for new projects and new funding in the future, really try and get in there at the very ground floor. You can't just be thought of as like a data consultant to bring in the climate information after the fact. And the last point, I mean, it very much relates to that constant engagement. Is that we need to be advisors, not just science providers, especially in the relationship. You know, if we're leveraging high capacity science expertise from the best universities in the world, it can't just be seen as dumping science over the fence. We really need a lot of constant, lengthy, over years engagement to really build the capacity to understand what we're talking about from a climate risk perspective. So I will just, I'll stop there. Yeah, sure. Actually, well, let me just quickly bring this up. So I tossed a few questions up there. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but yeah.
So thanks, Ryan. That was great. At the beginning to introduce myself. I'm Jose. Thank you to the Atlas Project for hosting us here. This was great. And one of the things that, in addition to what Ryan said, a lot of the messages coming out of this partnership, WWF and
Colombia.
More easily said than whatever the full acronym is, are similar to the ones that from the IRAP project, which is Arizona and IRI, also in Colombia, and work that is coming up in lots of places. There's getting through the information that through questions for use information put in the future in thematic. This idea of actually rather than loading dock, dumping it over the fence approach to data provision, maybe a sort of advisor, a counselor, rather than a aloof person who's going to mail you some information. That's awesome, great to see. Questions for you guys, and then if anybody's online and has questions. This is being okay.
I think I have to keep.
So,
presentation, Kelly Witkowski, Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture.
that microphone works for online. Doesn't work in the room.
So I can't hear your voice.
Okay.
You have to yell into it.
Kelly Witkowski, Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. I think it was really interesting, especially in your Myanmar example, of how you worked kind of both at the government level and then talked about taking the information to the communities. And that you use slightly different processes. And I was just wondering a little bit if you could talk about the difference you saw in kind of the utility of the kinds of maps and projections you're producing when thinking about the different roles that like a community person would have what adaptation measures they would be most interested in for the personal livelihoods versus kind of the more transformational role that the government has to play kind of at the national level?
Super easy question. No, I'm just kidding. But, yeah, I mean, you saw it. Very different roles and different amounts of information that we were focusing on in both places. DMH is obviously a much higher capacity, and they wanted to see the details of even just like statistical downscaling approach that we took. You know, there were people that were very interested in that. But yeah, I mean, it was hard not to walk away from this thinking, especially based on the community example, that we don't need all this complexity. We can just interpret the general trends and work with them to build resilience that way. But that's also, it's like a necessary sufficiency problem. That's a good start, but it's not enough if we really want to get into, you know, helping them or relying on ecosystem services in the future. Like building up that resilience requires a lot more technical information and long-term research. You know, I was just talking earlier about how every place that I've been to, I feel like there's 10 PhDs sitting in front of me of people that should be looking at the interactions between climate variables and like key ecological system variables. You just don't have that information to say, you should plant this mangrove species at this altitude in this location because we know for sure it's resilient to this change in salinity, this change in precipitation, and this change in extreme heat. Not there. I don't know if that answered your question. We can talk after if you want.
Hi, I'm Mokshmi Chaudhary with the World Resources Institute. I really enjoyed your presentation, especially because I enjoy working on co-creating and co-generating climate plans. It seems like most of the work that you've talked about has happened at the national level, and I'm wondering to what extent have you really worked at the community level? And I ask that because in my experience translating climate science to the community level and also incorporating community perspectives on their understanding of climate science is very, very difficult, and trying to make that bridge is a challenge, even from a participation angle where you need to have equal participation from men and women, and it poses a lot of challenges. And was wondering if you could expand on your experiences there, and also now that you've learned all these lessons, how will you try and create uptake? What are your plans?
I may toss it over to Sean, who was in Kyrgyzstan for some of this, but there were some interesting lessons from our work in Kyrgyzstan and local communities. One comes to mind. We did a scenario planning exercise, and we had to sort of pick scenarios to plan for, and they picked the best one. In other words, in their mind, the least amount of change was like it was a choice, not that you should plan for everything. That's one example. I mean, in this work, it was very difficult to separate the changes that have been happening from a climate-driven factor and just a land use or an upstream deforestation or whatever. That was a challenge, particularly in this case in the dry zone in Myanmar. There's a lot of water quality issues that are long-standing. There's a lot of arsenic in the groundwater. There's a lot of it's a high saline groundwater anyways. And so it was hard to really tease out exactly what's a climate driver and what's not. At the end of the day, I don't know how important that is in terms of action. It just, I mean, in theory, it could change the solution, but for the most part, you still need to address the same problem. I don't know. Do you want to expand on that at all, Sean?
Yeah, so your question was, Ryan's examples are pretty much national level or expert level, and I was working with Advance in a very, very small community in rural, high-altitude Kyrgyzstan, where we learned, as Ryan said, we learned a lot of great things working with that community, and it is very different working with both national government experts. So climate change was something they were aware of. We found that in that in that context, older people were much more open to thinking about drastic change than younger people, which is something that we weren't expecting. We also, before we went to the community, we had a local experts workshop in Bishkek, the capital city. And so we had Kyrgyz people telling us these are the seasons, this is what happens, people do this in May and September, they do that. When we got to the community, that was all wrong. So even our perception of what's local changed. And so if you're just working with the government people thinking that they're speaking on behalf of the local people, we realize, well, that's really not true. The governance complexities were immense. They have 4 different committees for water, whether it's drinking water, irrigation water, pasture water, river water, and 4 different kinds of pastures and 4 different kinds of forest management boards. So it got a lot more complex, but the climate part wasn't too difficult, actually. It was the governance structures and how to take that information and weave it through all these complexities that was really hard. And by the way, a lot of people blame this on the United States, and that the changes that we're seeing was a U.S. plot against Russia. Was also, so we didn't talk about climate change too much because it's already taken it. Just this one.
Ryan, thanks.
Hi, Jeff.
Thank you. Your presentation brought up a lot of questions, but because other hands are up, I'll limit myself to just maybe 1 or 2. One of the big takeaways for me seemed to be this.
Just realized you need this too. Sorry.
I can just. Can you guys hear me if I talk like this?
The TV.
It's for the TV.
All right. So, can you hear me over there? So, one of the takeaways for me was this tension in terms of investments in the climate science, the downscaling, and trying to understand the system dynamics, the thresholds. And I thought that part was really interesting, that you showed how hard that was, and in my experience also, that's really hard. So what would you say we should do based on your experience? Like, should we invest a lot more in trying to get really finer resolution climate information that farmers can use for, when to plant whatever species? Or, how do we balance that? The second unrelated point is, and I'll stop after this, think about the scenario planning, where you talked about how uncertainty inevitably brings up the necessity to actually do that, and you said how hard that is, and I agree that's hard, but it's, I think we have to. And so what are the prospects, given your experience doing this now, in trying to get scenario planning embedded in integrated land use planning processes and budgeting and investment processes? Because that's where we'll see, I think, some changes actually happening, because the decisions that are in these 5-year socioeconomic development plans or whatever are going to actually have ripple effects 25 years down.
So the first one was about the balance of resources in understanding thresholds versus climate science. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, to give you a slippery politician's answer. You should do both. I think in the ideal world, you have your climate science expertise, and then you have your sort of thresholds and ecosystem resilience expertise at the same time. You have that collective team that's working together. But if anything, this work has highlighted for me that we don't, across the board, we don't have nearly enough information about what's happening in ecosystems and how they're responding to these types of changes. Every day there's another article that comes out that's extremely alarming. We find out that we've been overly conservative about understanding system dynamics and how resilient those systems are. This week it was the Great Barrier Reef, but pick a system. So yeah, I don't know. I think the other piece of that is really in that advisory space, people that can connect those two worlds much more effectively. And I don't know what the exact expertise or training that's required to really do that well, whether you should come from the ecosystem dynamics side or whether you should come from the climate side. Maybe there's probably an idea in here for a new master's degree or something, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's always going to be a tough balance, I think. I think we're starting to get to a point of sort of saturation on the climate system side, just because there are such inherent limitations in what the models can do. Technology might bring us ever closer and closer to better downscaling, but we're always going to have that gap just because we don't have the historical weather station data. So unless somebody comes up with a way to like recreate the past weather, who knows? I don't know. This is where I'm way out of my depth on climate change. On the second question on scenario planning, you're right that it has to happen. I mean, one of the sort of quick and dirty solutions is to map out your scenario axes and then pick the worst one and only plan for that one, because conceivably that's helping you plan for the other more mild scenarios. So that's at least how we started initially. Take the most extreme case, and that way you're being the most conservative in how you're planning for potential changes. That's one shortcut. But it doesn't, in the world of limited resources, that's not necessarily the best option either. Yeah, I think so the U.S. government, the National Park Service, has done a lot of great work on scenario planning. And if I had $1 billion, I would pay for them to go train everybody else around the world to do it right. That's not a priority right now. Yeah, sorry. Get to do the two mics thing.
I can hold this one. I tend to speak pretty loud. So the slide that struck me the most was the 30% above, 30% below.
Yeah.
You give people the information they, and average it all out at WNC it's like, okay, we're fine.
Yeah.
But given what you just discussed, preparing for the worst case scenario as an option.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario of 30% more rain is a very different situation than 30% less rain. So, how do you, are people asking for, what's the percentage of likelihood within these different areas? Because the blue line is very different than the red line, and both are awful, but...
Yeah. Way to puncture a huge hole in my argument just now. No, it totally depends on the context, right? At least, it depends on the season, so it's hard to look at this as totally absent any context. But yeah, you're right. When you do run into those cases, like let's take the dry season in Myanmar. Come on. Or the hot season, for the immediate future, it's basically an increase or a decrease. But that's not necessarily the most important season for Myanmar anyways. Most of the rain comes in the wet season. So, and at least in this case, we have a definite trend. What's a lot harder, and I don't know the answer to your question, are that Colombian case where it's basically like kind of a gradual rainy season all year long. Absent that, what I always come back to is increasing variability. So plan for a lot of fluctuation between the two over rapid period, short periods of time, and extremes. So be ready for both devastating droughts and heavy floods. But again, it's always context. I don't know if that. Okay.
I think though that plus, minus, plus 30, plus 30% weather could have a lot more damage than 30% drier. So the worst case scenario is which is going to have more impact.
Yeah.
And that's the first place you start, and then you work from there. If you're working in a wet area, you can afford to lose 30% of your rainfall maybe, but if you're working in a very dry area, you can't.
I was going to add that decision on that would influence ecosystem-based adaptation. So using something like mangroves to manage the problem is very different than somebody's trying to decide on an economic activity like what to plant. Because then the worst case might mean I'm not doing anything. I'm going to withdraw from economic activity for this year and go to a city and work. And then you don't want to push them to that as a chronic possibility, because it's not going to be like that every year, at least not in the near term when they're making economic decisions. So the type of decision that's being made is really important for what you do with that as well.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Pamela Collins. I'm a AAAS fellow at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I have a question more about the partnerships in the program overall. You said that you had 11 different partnerships in mostly Asia and South America. I was just wondering, how were those initiated? Did the countries approach WWF, or how were those solicited? How are they funded? What's their duration? And what kind of actual planning outcomes have you seen thus far in terms of changes in a country's 5-year plan or changes in a town's farming behavior or something along those lines? Thank you.
Yeah. The tough questions would come from a AAAS fellow, I suppose, the Army Corps. No, good questions. In terms of how they emerged, is kind of a mishmash. It was, a lot of it was pretty organic, existing programs that we had opportunities to go in based on funding available at WWF US specifically. Other projects that called for a climate risk analysis, and then a couple where we did, from the very beginning, it was, we're going to seek out these places to do this type of work. And in terms of partnerships on the ground, local implementation, that was, we're working in collaboration with our field staff. In one case, it was incorporating this information into an existing USAID funded project in Central Asia that covers a lot of countries. So that was that mechanism or that infrastructure was already. In terms of results, we're inching toward tangible things, but it's very hard to say. I can't say right now that the Myanmar government is doing things differently based on the climate risk information that we've given. We at the very least have some sort of coastal plans in Colombia that will be modified based on this information in terms of a sort of conservation, sustainable development. And then the other place where I'm trying to think of this. Another example is that we did this in Bhutan, and that information is being incorporated into a proposal for the GCF to do a lot more work for a lot more funding. Oh, that's right. So it's Central Asia, it's GIZ. GIZ is the big player there. They fund a lot of climate work. And we're helping them with ecosystem-based adaptation. So that's where their planning literally depends on this information. One by.
This kind of follows on from some of the questions that we've already had about reporting on extremes, and I understand the value of that because it kind of gives you a best case and worst case scenario. But in those plots where you have kind of the range reported, is there not a risk of misinterpretation if you don't also report the most likely scenario? And if you're trying to plan for the future, would it not make sense to plan for more the kind of the most probable scenario rather than the extremes?
Yeah, I mean, this is where my colleagues in Colombia are probably screaming to themselves on the phone in New York. But I get this right. But basically, we're under the operating principle that no single model is the most accurate. That's why we're taking a statistical sample of all of them in every place. So we ran into this in Colombia, where the Colombian government picked 5 models that they feel best represent Colombia's climate, and they use an average of only those. We had a bit of a back and forth with the representative that was giving that presentation about, what's the optimal approach from a climate science perspective. And so my colleagues in Colombia are adamant that, that no single model best captures a single place. The best approach is to be that cautionary and take that statistical sample that represents the range of possibilities. So in other words, it's really hard to get to the most likely. Yeah, no, sorry, that's right. So we're taking a 25th and a 75th percentile and always depicting that range. We could have gone first and 99th, but 25th and 75th seemed like the most sort of reasonable range of the data.
Yeah, there's actually a couple. The first one is, does this model also work locally in the U.S.? For example, would it be useful for communities in the Chesapeake watershed to understand the impact of climate change on communities? And if so, do you have suggestions on how to present the range of impacts? Would local news weather programs be a good source for delivery of this message? And the other is, we'll go ahead and, where do you think the sweet spot will be for investment and capacity building for downscaling projections to make a range of development services and natural resource management, or say health delivery systems to address vector-borne diseases, be able to prove value or prove concept?
Tough questions today. So the first one about using this in the US, I think generally the model is relevant everywhere. It really depends on your target audience and what you're trying to do. In the US, it's a much more developed context, so you're talking a lot more about engineered systems, or at least a system that you have a lot more control over. So you have an ability to, it makes more sense to use you generally have higher capacity, for example, in engineering to address a lot of these problems. And otherwise, it comes down to monitoring. We're doing the best that we can in ecosystems in this country to monitor change. But then you get into real challenges there that are totally different about how much influence and how much of a hand people should have in helping ecosystems adapt. So you see things like transplanting of tree species in national parks, or introducing new species. That's fairly controversial. But yeah, generally speaking, I think it makes sense on a local community scale in the U.S. to try something like this. As for whether weatherman or weathermen, they're weathermen, Jesus. I think that yeah, they're the natural sort of communicators of this. But for a long time, meteorologists were skeptics of climate change. That's definitely changed recently. So yeah, I don't know. Good set. And then the second question was about sweet spot. I don't know nearly enough about health delivery systems. Yeah, I just don't know. I mean, I think that the technology for doing climate projections is getting better and cheaper all the time. But it still is a very high capacity thing to do. It's very expensive to do that right. I mean, in theory, if we can do something like this for relatively cheap, where we're getting a sense of like very extreme hot days and a sense of the changes in seasons, I could imagine a health program trying to adapt its vector-borne disease response based on forecasting using this type of information. But if they want something much more high resolution than that, that's a difficult question. I don't know if we'll get there anytime soon.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan. It was really interesting. Thanks to you online. Thanks for everybody for coming. Remember, next month we're going to have 2 of these. The first will be on April 6th at 4 o'clock in this room, looking at sort of a preview of the international chapter of the next U.S. National Climate Assessment. We'll have several of the author team here. And then on April 20th, yes, Erica Havani is going to talk about the Africa Risk Capacity Program in this room. Okay, and we'll send out announcements and invitations. If you don't get our emails, I think to sign up on the papers outside, then you will. thank you for coming. Thanks to Atlas and Chemonics for hosting us, and we'll see you in a few weeks.